Hey, everybody, remember, none of those people out there in business land that you are talking to, or few of them, know what we mean when we're talking about a process.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with various BPM practitioners, people that are putting BPM into practice day in and day out. We're not covering theory here. We're going to be hearing some fantastic stories and experiences and how different people have overcome challenges and hurdles when putting BPM into practice. And in today's episode, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Alec who has come widely recommended. I've had quite a few people asking me, when's Alec going to be on the show? You need to get in touch with Alec. So I'm really excited for this interview. Alec, thanks for joining me.
That's very gratifying. Thank you. I'm feeling really chuffed to be here because the people I most respect in the field, like Roger Burleton, Roger Tregear, my hero, Michael Roseman, have been interviewed. So I feel like I'm in good company. I'm grateful for the opportunity.
That's fantastic. And so Alec's been a consultant for, I think, around 40 plus years now. So I've been doing this for a long time, working with some of the world's largest organizations. So he's got such a diverse range of experience working at such a high level and under the name of Clariteq, the consulting company that you started with your wife. But maybe, Alec, what you can do is take us back to day one. I think this is an interesting story that people generally like to hear is, how did you first get into the concept or the topic of BPM, and take us on a journey, a brief journey leading up to what you're doing today?
Yeah, well, it actually started with data. When I went out on my own as a consultant in, I think it was 1981. So that was 40 years ago, which is a little bit frightening. And I was a data guy, initially doing data modeling, and then my clients gave me a lot of flexibility to introduce what I called subject area data modeling. So I was working with what we would now recognize as cross-functional teams building enterprise scale data models or concept models. Right. And so that taught me a lot about facilitating cross-functional groups. And then in 1990, 1991, when business process reengineering burst on the scene, my clients who were very interested in this said, Alec seems to be pretty good at facilitating cross-functional groups, so let's make him facilitate these end-to-end cross-functional process initiatives. Right. So I kind of jumped in, learned by doing, and by reading Tom Davenport and Michael Hammer, still Rumler and Braish, still required reading, even though those were written a long time ago. And then the next big break for me was I realized I had a fairly unique approach to this. So clients wanted me to build a workshop to teach their people how to do it. And so I did that, and then that went crazy. And before I knew it, I was going to Europe and Asia. So my advice, everybody who asks me, what should I do if I want to become a consultant? And I say, build something that demonstrates your unique perspective and your value proposition. So once, I got into the curriculum at all these major companies, and then the diaspora went elsewhere. And so it was all reference, but it's been a pretty great ride.
That's amazing. And that's when you're onto something good, is when people are moving around and changing to a different organization, and people are talking, and they're talking about what worked well, and you're getting invited to new places. You've got something good when it's spreading like that organically.
Yeah, it's just incredibly gratifying. And it was, and I think another thing I'll just mention quickly that has been accounted for some of why it's worked is I'm not just process. I still, especially in recent years, I'm very active in the data field. So a lot of large European organizations have me in training their people in concept modeling and the connection with business process. And I do a lot of application requirements and application architecture. So when you put process, application, data together, it's a powerful combination.
And do you think that, are you finding that organizations understand or can see the value in having that combination? Some people are very much in their data modeling lane. Some people are very much in the process lane. Do you think people understand that link and that connection?
Not widely, but it's increasing. I am feeling very encouraged over the last 5 years or so at what I'm seeing at these large client sites. I think for many years, largely driven by senior management, there was this expectation that the software vendor will save us, agile will save us, off-the-shelf frameworks will save us. And there's just this more realistic perspective that, we have to do the hard work, but it's not actually so hard, But
Yes.
we have to get our people together and identify our end-to-end processes. And then my approach is, as many of your viewers will know, I'm big on verbs and nouns, and the nouns tend to be the objects in your data model or your object model. So it's a very natural connection.
Yes.
We're still lacking a little bit in awareness at the executive level.
Right.
Executives tend still not to understand end-to-end processes, but I find, feet on the ground, mid-level, even up to the more senior levels, people are really getting it.
Yeah.
It's been very encouraging.
That's great. And why do you think that is? Why do you think that the executive level still are struggling to see? And I guess that's obviously a generalization across the board, but why do you think they struggle to see the value in process? Is it because it's rarely linked to the overall strategy, or what do you think it is?
I think so. I think there's a number of factors. Honestly, sometimes proponents of business process management fall into almost like two camps. And there are those that want to take a top-heavy, boil the ocean approach. We've got to get our entire enterprise architecture in place before we can do any of this. And then there are others who are much more opportunistic. And that's the camp that I'm in. But I think also, senior executives, like, who reports to them? The owners of functional areas.
Right.
Customer service, engineering, logistics, finance. So their view of the world is very largely based on functions and performance measures. That's the biggest problem in private enterprise, is poorly designed performance measures, which are often also very functional.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah. If I can go just a little bit further, I do an executive briefing that is between 60 and 90 minutes. I've probably delivered it 80 times around the world. And my philosophy in that is not to lecture, not to harangue executives about they need to get on board with business process. I try to just tell them interesting stories. Like, hey, you may be surprised to know that the performance measures may be the biggest problem. And then I give examples, anonymized, from the world's largest organizations, and there's a lot of, face palming. And that this is not a technocratic undertaking. That technology is important, but the human, social, and organizational factors are more important. So I just try to tell them something interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
Beginning with what actually is a process. Hey, everybody, remember, none of those people out there in business land that you are talking to, or few of them, know what we mean when we're talking about a process. we mean, going back to the days of Michael Hammer, we mean an end-to-end cross-functional business process. And when I do these briefings, the first thing I do is show the difference between the functional or organizational perspective and the business process perspective and what the consequences are. I was at America's largest energy company, or well, in one sector. A couple of years ago, I was doing a briefing, and the president and all of his direct reports were there. And at one point, the president face-palmed. He just went, "Oh no, now I see why our process improvement efforts always fail."
Right.
And I asked him, I said, "Great, could you put that into words?" And he said, "Yeah, we're doing functional improvement, not process improvement."
Right.
And that's so common. So people think a process, they confuse process and procedure. They think of a process in organizational terms. So we have to demonstrate what we actually mean. And I'll probably share some examples.
Yeah, and just on the back of that, obviously being talking about challenges when an organization attempts to adopt BPM, because you would have heard more stories than I have about where BPM has been adopted and implemented well, and when it's also been adopted and implemented not so well. And so I think it'd be interesting to understand, what do you think are the biggest challenges an organization face? Or what are the ones that come to mind when they are adopting BPM and trying to implement it as part of their management, the way they manage?
Well, as you know, and apologies to all the BPM professionals out there, I am not fond of the name BPM, Business Process Management. I think it was maybe 8 or 10 years ago, I decided on every assignment, I would ask people right at the beginning, what do you think when you hear the phrase business process or business process management? And I naively thought the answer was going to be, cooperation, engagement, achievement of results, transparency. And what I got was just incredibly negative. I remember one person saying, process, ew, the P word. And another at an academic institution, they decomposed it. They said, business, we hate business. Process, we hate process. That's somebody trying to control us. And management, we hate management. So, I could go on. So I don't personally call it business process management. I try and think and my clients, when they bring me in, they may not be thinking of business process. They just know that they've got issues and they need help. But anyway, the barriers they face, I think it's just embedded in the DNA of especially large established organizations, this functional view, and there isn't anything really pulling in that process direction. There is also the tendency to try and make it so top down and enterprise wide, it becomes a daunting prospect. So I'm big on being an opportunist. Finding an opportunity to use these techniques. Maybe we won't be able to look at an entire end-to-end process, but if we can do something cross-functional that makes the world better, then people tend to share those stories.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm answering the question or not.
I think that's great.
I see maybe it'll help if I just mention that I do a lot of work where I call it project recovery, or a company is struggling with their process improvement initiatives, or they've had some big project like they're acquiring a new piece of software and that's not going well. So I come in and the 3 common denominators I see are a failure to identify a true end-to-end process. Number 2, a premature diagnosis of the problem. And in fact, let me say another word about that. One of my mantras is what first, who and how next, only then why. Which is the exact opposite of what Simon Sinek, he said, always start with why. In this field, I tell people, don't start with why. Because if you just jump right in there with why are we doing this, what is the problem, like a premature diagnosis, the perspective will almost always end up being organizational or in the supporting technology. So I say, let's figure out what is or are the relevant end-to-end processes, then who is involved organizationally, how is the process currently supported, and then with this more holistic view, then we can say, why do we need to address this? I find a lot of my clients in recent years have been telling me I'm their change guy. I'm like a change management guy. And it turns out that pulling back to this level, and I could show, I prepared a PowerPoint slide, I could share that with the people, but pulling back to the, what is the process? A pure view, what is the trigger? What are the results? What are the major phases? What are the cases or variations? That tends to liberate people. Because now I'm not talking about my job, my department, my system, my performance measures. I'm just helping them identify the what.
Yes.
I find that very helpful. So failure to identify end-to-end processes, premature diagnosis of the problem, and when they do start modeling, I see it so often, a rapid descent into unhelpful detail.
Right. That's great. That's really interesting. It reminds me of a story that I've mentioned on the podcast a number of times, but I think it's just a fantastic story. A company here in Australia that they had the CEO was very process-centric, had a very process-centric way of running the organization and sort of instilled it in everyone that worked in this organization. And if someone came to him with a problem and said, oh, we've got an issue over here, we don't know what's going on, or we don't know how to fix it, the first thing he would say is, well, before I can help you, before I can give you any advice, until I understand what's going on, or what is the process, what are we working with here, I simply can't help you. So first, go away, understand what's going on, understand the process, the sequence of tasks that are happening. Then once you understand that, come back to me, and then we'll be able to start working towards a solution.
Yeah, and that's very much my approach as a consultant. Now, I will say every problem isn't a process problem. So in my initial conversations, I try to decide from the answers I am hearing, is this primarily a process issue? Is it primarily a data and information issue? Or is it just an organizational dysfunction issue?
Right.
If I think it is a process issue, well, let me show you. I'm going to bring up let me see, there we go, a little bit of PowerPoint. So and let me put this there. So I have this very simple framework that one of my students actually named it. He named it TRACK, which is the framework for building what I call a process scope model. And it is a pure statement of what is the process. So what is the trigger that initiates it? What are the results perceived by the various stakeholders? What are the main phases or activities? So not even individual tasks yet. These are just milestones. And what are the significant cases or variations? And when I get called in to do project recovery, especially failed software implementations, 100% of the time, I have to do one of these. I have to do this to get people out of the weeds. And then I will simplify the what, and I'll add the who, and later on some how, and build what I call a process summary chart. My favorite diagram, because this is the one that, like that executive who faced palm, this is the one that helped him see, oh my gosh, we've been trying to improve our functions without awareness of the end-to-end process. And the way I always make the point is to show that all of these functions have performance measures that are pulling them in different directions.
Right. Okay.
So that's, and that's why I say now that we know the what and the who, now we can ask why does this process need to change?
Right.
I might start at a higher level with what I call a process landscape, but let's get back to the interview.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. And obviously, I guess a big part of talking to executives or even talking to middle management, getting buy-in for BPM, I think a big part of that or a valuable, attractive part of that would be sharing wins. Well, what has worked for other organizations? How has other organizations put it into practice? And what actual, like what tangible results have they gotten out of it? So do you have any that you're able to share with us? Obviously censor the parts that you're not allowed to share, but where an organization has adopted BPM and it has delivered significant value to them.
Oh, yeah. And this, I think I can safely mention one of my favorite clients was at the University of Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. And they had a group called UPI, University Process Improvement, led by Joe Drayson. Definitely a guy who should be on your interview list.
Right.
And they started sort of on a smaller scale, but what they did was they didn't try to boil the ocean. They might go in and say, okay, well, we're looking at managing a sponsored research project. They would build that scope model, and then within that say, if we can fix these two phases, that will be a win.
Right.
And when they do that, then, now they're basically, I believe, have more work than they can handle because people tell other people about their success. And they brought in our friend, Sandeep, who you have interviewed. So they brought in Sandeep to help them productize their process. And I think Sandeep, helped them articulate their wins and basically build the awareness. And now, the awareness is right up to the executive level.
Yes, yeah. And I have heard that take place before where an organization has, before they do get buy-in from the wider organization, they implement a small process improvement on a project level or on a very small level. They identify a core or a critical process in that area, and they make those improvements, make those changes, reap the value from that. And then before they know it, the wider business unit, the wider department takes notice. They want to know, what are you doing? And then before you know it, the whole organization is looking at this area being like, wow, like what are you guys doing to return such results?
Yes, absolutely. And that's honestly, almost every success story I've seen in terms of raising process awareness follows that model. Local wins, capture them, promote them, and move on. And also, another part of that is not lecturing people. I like to tell interesting stories. I made a decision as a consultant probably 30 years ago that I would eliminate the word convince from my vocabulary. And I also pretty much eliminated the word sell. So if somebody says, how do I convince management of the value of BPM? Then I say, well, first, let's think, how can we demonstrate? And when you think in terms of demonstrating, as opposed to hectoring and haranguing and lecturing, if you think in terms of demonstrating, then that's more successful. And don't go overboard making claims that Because remember, senior executives are getting told by all kinds of people that if you implement what I'm talking about, you will have improved responsiveness, better levels of innovation, your customer retention will go up. And that comes from, everybody makes those claims.
Yes.
So I try not to go over the top. I try not to make promises, but I think my experience is if you show people what we mean by an end-to-end process and how it is cross-functional and how performance measures and poorly thought out policies can impair it, it becomes second nature. It's just, it's almost intuitive.
Yes.
So that's what I'm going to appeal to.
That's great. And when you are, when an organization, because we'll have people listening to this that are, in all a range of different organizations at a range of different levels of like process maturity, you could call it, that maybe they're at a point where they want to try some process improvement, and they're at the point where they want to identify, well, where do we begin? What is that process, that core process that we can focus on that's going to return value, so we can demonstrate that, hey, there is value in doing this work. What would you encourage them? How would you advise them when looking for that process to improve? What should they be looking for? What makes for a good process for process improvement?
Oh boy, do you have an easier question? I think if it's a source of common complaints and pain, that's as good a starting point. So I've worked actually with a lot of startups. So this is not just for big multinationals. So most of my clients are large global organizations, but I've worked with startups, usually by the time they get to around 30 or 40 people. By the way, that's one of my magic numbers. I spoke to an MBA class, the entrepreneurial MBA class, and the question was, when do we start worrying about business processes? And my answer was, well, it seems to me that usually when you have around 40 people, because that's the point where it is no longer possible for everybody to know what everybody else is doing. Up until 35 or 40, we can manage. Now, I have friends who say it's at 100 people, but it's long before you get to 500 or 1,000. And in these startups, when I get asked, well, where should we start? There's three very likely places. One is onboard a new customer. Another is onboard a new employee, because every customer is going to go through onboarding and every employee is going to go through onboarding. And the other is to launch a product.
Right.
Now, in different industries, it might be launch and develop and launch product might be a single process. When I did work, and I think it's safe to say this, I have done a lot of work at Microsoft. In that organization, develop a product is a separate process than launch a product, because they launch it geography by geography or customer by customer. But every worker, every customer, and every product has to go through those processes. So you probably won't regret starting there. And they also tend to be relatively transactional processes. Like developing a product, that's a lot more creative and collaborative and a little bit more difficult, like developing a marketing campaign. But onboard employee, onboard customer, etc., those tend to follow a more defined process.
That's good. That's great. And we've spoken quite a bit about talking or communicating with executives, and I guess their challenges with BPM. And I guess another another people group that you would need to get buy-in when introducing BPM is the actual process participants, the ones that when you're making those changes to their processes, the ones that are carrying out the processes, and the ones that, they might have been doing this job for the last 5, 10, 15 years. And you're coming in there to be like, whether you're coming in as a consultant or whether you're coming in as a part of the internal process team, you're going along being like, hey, we're going to change your processes. How do you get buy-in from them? Because I can't imagine that, I can't imagine it's the easiest thing to just go and make changes to someone else's processes and simply for them to follow it to a T.
Yeah.
So talk to us about that.
Oh, okay. I had an exchange a few years ago with the chief information officer at a very well-known American research university. In fact, he was the higher education CIO of the year some number of years ago, and he arranged this, I guess not Zoom, where we were on Skype, I guess. I was in an airport, of course. And he said, Alec, I have heard from other universities that you've really helped them improve their procurement processes. Procurement, by the way, is one of the most broken processes in higher education and in a lot of industries. Anyway, he said, I'd like you to come in and share best practices with us so we can get ahead of the curve. And I said, well, I'd love to. I love your school, I love your city, but I'm afraid I can't. And he said, oh, you're too busy? And I said, no, because it wouldn't work. And he said, well, what do you mean it wouldn't work? I said, if I showed up with there's no such thing as best practices. There are only practices that are best in a certain situation. And I have to work with your people and bring them through the act of discovering what their processes are, their true processes. Then doing the stakeholder-based assessment that I can share with you. Help them see that everybody is feeling pain and it's nobody's fault. It's a systemic issue. And then we'll start to get into more detailed analysis. So I have this, it's a methodology that I describe it in some webinars and webisodes I did with LucidChart, and we'll be sharing the link with people. But you need to go through all of the steps. And this CIO, he said, I think I understand. You can't skip the therapy. And no, you can't. So I don't try to convince anybody. I got in trouble once with U.S. immigration. I was applying for a visa, and I went through like an hour of getting interrogated about what I do and why I was coming down to the States. And at the end, the officer said, oh, I think I understand. You go into a company and you tell them what their problems are and what they should do about it. And I should have just said, yeah, you got it. But like an idiot, I said, well, no, not actually. And you could just see him go, oh, no. And I explained, and this is the truth. I never tell a client what the problem is, and I never tell them what they should do. I have a framework that lets them identify and take ownership of the problem, and I have frameworks that help them define the holistic measures that will be successful. So now I've been talking so long I can't remember what the original question was. But oh, I know. So it was about the naysayers, the resistors. Starting maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I had a number of clients come to me. I'm thinking of one higher education client who came to me and said, we are wondering if you have a degree in organizational psychology. And I said, well, no, why? Well, when we follow your methodology, and by the way, it's very fast and lightweight. We're talking days, not weeks and months. But so I can say more about that. But when we follow these steps almost slavishly, the usual resistance to change simply doesn't appear. And honestly, for me, resistance to change is a foreign concept. because
Right.
I've been refining my methodology for 30 years in response to resistance to change. And I think it begins with not talking about the change too quickly,
Right.
helping people along for the journey, letting them vent. Letting them just get whatever's on your chest, get it off your chest. That turns out to be a very helpful thing. Seeing the what of the process before we start talking about what's wrong with it and what should be changed. That is very helpful. I could go on and on. I better stop.
But I think it's good because I think, if changes are going to be made internally, you've got a number of stakeholders that you're working with there, and you need to bring them along for the journey.
That's the best phrase. Bring them along for the journey. Yeah.
Yeah. And I like what you were saying earlier about your framework allowing the organization to find out what works for them. Because I've heard a lot of stories of, consultants coming in to an organization, and they'll put their thing into practice, but when they leave, the organization hasn't quite got to the point where they've owned it, where they take ownership of it. And so when the consultants leave, it's like, hang on a second, what do we do with this again?
And part of that is, sorry.
No, you go.
Part of that is a failure to take a holistic look at what needs to change. And so if I have the liberty, maybe I could quickly share another, because it'll just make it a little easier to talk about. So let me go here. Okay, so we looked at this idea of identifying, like building a scope model and a summary chart. And I usually, when I'm doing this kind of work, I start, I'm very bottom up. And I start with the granular activities that people in the business recognize, or they tell me on a detailed level what they do. And using some frameworks that are and methods that are described in those lucid chart videos, we work our way up to the big picture, and then we start taking a controlled descent down through progressive refinement and elaboration. So this journey really helps people, they take ownership. So I go crazy when people try and start with an off-the-shelf framework. Most of those are catalogs of functions and activities with no end-to-end process element, and the people in the enterprise don't trust it.
Right.
Then I do these structured assessments where I make sure we understand the concerns of each stakeholder group. And personally, I'm even more interested in the people who do the work than I am in the customer, because the people who do the work, their perspective is often ignored.
Right. Okay.
And you can't treat the customer any better than you treat the people. And then I make it blame-free. I put it in context. What are the changes in the environment that have caused what used to be a perfectly good process to no longer be acceptable? And usually it is change, like there's new regulations, there are competitive threats, social factors, customer expectations, and then what are the consequences of inaction? If we leave this as it is, what's going to happen to us as individuals and the organization as a whole? And that usually takes care of the naysayers.
Yes.
Because this is fact-based.
Yes,
And then the final thing, okay, so I've made this point already. What first, who and how next, and only then why. And if people want, I guess we could put these slides together in a link and they can access them.
Yep.
But then the final point that I wanted to make is, once that consulting company comes in, implements the process they implemented at the previous client, it's very often like a square peg in a round hole. So the real heart of my approach is to consider all of the enablers of a process, not just what I call the usual suspects,
Right.
the design of the process and the use of the technology, but where I find the most significant issues lie. with performance measures, role definition and organizational structure, and policies and rules. And I'll shout out to my friend Roger Burleton. When we first met each other at the first enterprise application, no, it was the first enterprise architecture conference back in 1998, we went to each other's presentations and we each thought that the other, like I thought Roger had ripped me off, and Roger thought that, well, you know where I'm going with this, because Roger has the famous Burleton hexagon, but it makes almost the identical point. And I took so much satisfaction in knowing that the two of us had independently came up with a framework that said, these are the issues that make a process sustainable. So if you just insert it without rethinking your performance measures, without rethinking your roles, then it's probably not going to be successful.
Yes, right.
Okay. Thank you.
Great.
It's just easier for me to make my point when I've got those
definitely. Thanks for sharing those slides. Now that an organization, say, they found that core process or that process that they want to start working on a small scale, they start making those improvements or changes, they're starting to manage their process well, and they start to get value from that. What are some objections that they're going to face as BPM, I guess, gets more attention throughout the organization as they go to improve more processes, or it gets adopted wider? What are some objections that they may face?
Well, one objection is simply going to be in language. So we have to recognize that the vast majority of people in the enterprise, when they hear the word process, what registers in their mind is procedure. So they think they're going to be constrained. So we have to demonstrate what we mean. This is, like I often try to express it, is how we get things done around here and how we all get along. So just the language is going to be an issue. And the other thing is, if you are going to negatively impact somebody's ability to meet their performance targets, you are going to get pushback. Right. And so that's why very often the most important thing we do, we have to understand how individual roles, individual departments, individual functions, how is their performance measured and how is it rewarded or punished. And
yes, right.
If we do something, that seems to be an improvement in here, but is going to negatively impact somebody's performance measure, that's going to be a common objection.
Yes.
And then there's one other thing I'll mention. I taught a workshop recently, and I had, for that organization, I had some of their top level agile proponents, their agile coaches. And I realized that, when I talked about modeling, that was a trigger word for them. And I gave real life examples where 90 minutes of modeling, in this case it was concept modeling, data modeling, but 90 minutes of modeling had a phenomenal impact on the success of an initiative. It was like they didn't even hear it. Just that the use of that word modeling, they just assumed what was burnt into their brain is one of these bottom up, years long modeling efforts, and I've seen those. They're ugly. So that's going to be an objection too. So we have to demonstrate and quantify what we are actually talking about.
That's great. That's good. I think it has come up a few times through our conversation today is around this idea of what language are you using? And I think what defines that, or what should define that, is, well, who are you speaking to? Who are you communicating with? Who are you trying to get on board? Because depending on the language you use, they could have negative triggers or negative reactions to.
Can I give you an example? One framework that I really do not like is input, process, output. And there's still well-known people in our field who say, well, a process is defined as input, process, output. Let me tell you, I have done a lot of work in what I call the mission-driven fields: healthcare, higher education, social services. And if I start talking to people about input, process, output, they'll want to throw me out because that's a manufacturing-oriented framework. And yeah, of course, I used it 30 years ago, and I found out that a lot of people hate it. They don't want, if I'm talking to a physician, they don't want to hear about input, process, output. So eventually, I started seeing things in terms of there's a triggering event, there's activity, there's results or outcomes.
Right.
And that simple change in language has a huge impact. Still surprises me, but so yeah, language shapes thought. And so some people, they hear the word process and that's, other people hear the word modeling. Oh, I hate that. Other people hear input, process, output. Get away from me.
And to wrap the conversation up, because we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I just there's two questions I just wanted to get your thoughts on, but and doesn't have to be long at all, but the future of BPM. I think, like, obviously you've been doing this for 40 plus years. So you would have seen the process landscape, how business adopts process management. You would have seen that changed over the years. Do you have any ideas or thoughts around like what's over the next 5-10 years or what's in the future?
I'm not very good at predicting the future, but I'm an optimist. And so I believe whether we call it business process management or what, I think people are like 20 or 30 years later than I hoped, but they are starting to see the limitations of these narrowly focused initiatives. And the Agile field is a great example. Agile originally was deployed on relatively small initiatives. Now it is assumed you will be using Agile even on enterprise scale initiatives. So what I've done, I've adapted my method for use. It's now very agile. I have a feature-based approach to process redesign. So I think whatever we call it, I'm feeling like the future looks bright, because how else can we succeed unless we look at how we cooperate end to end in delivering our results?
That's great. That's good. And last question was, for those that have been listening today, obviously we can only squeeze so much into a 40-minute conversation, and I'm sure you've sparked a lot of ideas and thoughts in people's minds where they want to understand what does process management look like, and how can it look, what can it look like for my organization, and where do I even begin? I think the excitement that you talk about working with process and improving process, I think, is infectious, and people will leave this interview conversation wanting to learn more. So where should they go?
Well, I encourage people to, first of all, go outside the business process field. You should be reading Harvard Business Review, Sloan Management Review. You should be reading the material that your senior executives are reading, or maybe you'll go to Fast Company. I'm always looking outside the field and saying, what could I borrow from that would help me in my business process work? And then also the exact opposite. I have clients, like there was at one client, people like individual business analysts and solution architects, they really loved this process stuff, and they formed an informal group, and they got together every 2 weeks for 60 or 90 minutes and shared their stories. Shared the wins, shared the losses, and I got to attend a few of those, and I learned a lot.
That's
so I think we just, that's actually a great starting point for process management, is just these informal working groups.
Yeah, I love that.
As I've said, I'm a bottom-up guy.
That's great. I love that because it's people that are connecting with other practitioners that are putting it into
Yes.
practice and learning on a day-to-day basis, and I think that's really valuable. But Alec, I just want to thank you so much for being part of this Process Pioneers episode. I've certainly been gleaning a lot. I've been taking a lot of notes, and I hope for those that are listening to this that you've been taking notes as well. And if you have any follow-up questions for Alec, please either leave them in the comment section below, whether you're on YouTube or LinkedIn or wherever you find this video. Otherwise, by all means, feel free to reach out to Alec and connect with him on LinkedIn. I'm sure he'd love to connect and answer any of your follow-up questions.
I would love that. I tell people every time I deliver a workshop, I end by asking people to bring their questions and comments to me. And I always say, you will not get a week of free consulting, but a lot of people have got 3 hours of free consulting because I learn from all these questions. In fact, I have meetings online the next 2 days with people I've never met, but they're taking me up on the offer. So
That's amazing.
I welcome it. And I assume in the material it will include my email address, my LinkedIn,
Yep.
the links to the webisodes. So I hope I hear from you, people.